just pray together. Oh, Heavenly Father, we thank you. Thank you for this glorious place and this glorious day. We thank you for the wonders of your creation, Lord. But more than that, that you are our healer, our provider, our creator, our saviour. Lord, I just ask that in this coming session that, Lord, you would help us to catch a glimpse of your glory and power in creation, in living things. Help us to see afresh, Lord, your intimate engagement with each and every one of us and every single thing that you've created. And that you, Lord, are bringing it all about to a culmination of fulfilment with the new heavens and the new earth. Thank you, Lord, that we have a place in your kingdom. Thank you for all that you are doing in our lives and have done. In Jesus' name. Amen. Fearfully and wonderfully made. There's a psalm, isn't there, that speaks of that, and I think Eunice had it this morning. Psalm 139, and the one particular verse there, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Now, I have an Australian translation of the Bible. Did you know there's an Aussie Bible? And that last phrase said, it's freaking obvious. I mean, when you look around the world, you look at living things, and, you know, the psalmist says in a very dignified way, I know that full well. But it's freaking obvious, isn't it? It must have been designed and made. Living organisms cannot possibly be the results of chance. But this debate between the naturalistic view of origins, the evolutionary story, and the creation account in the Bible is often held up as a battle between science and faith. And this was in fact the headline of Time magazine some years ago. But it's interesting that this really isn't an issue of science versus faith at all. Because when the debate is set that way, it makes the Christian look like he's switched his brain off and is just regurgitating stuff he might have been taught as a child or whatever, or unthinking blind faith. But here's an interesting quotation. This comes from a man called Richard Lewontin, who was a very famous evolutionist, and he said, we take the side of evolutionary science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs. Now you need to think a bit about what he's saying here, because it's pretty revealing. He's just said that some of the constructs of evolutionary science are patently absurd. Anyway, pressing on, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. So it's giving away this idea that the universe consists of material things only. It's just stuff, it's nothing else. And he goes on, and I love this last bit. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, doesn't that give away what's going on here? You see, this is not a discussion about science, it's a discussion about religion. It's a belief system that's happening here. So really, it's faith versus faith. We're really discussing the science of one belief system versus the science of another belief system. And you remember from the previous talk, one belief system begins by assuming there is no God. The other begins by assuming there is a God. And naturally enough, they lead to radically different conclusions. The fact that evolution is a religion is actually recognised by the philosophers themselves. And here Michael Roos, Professor of Philosophy, says, evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it's true of evolution still today. Now, the evolutionists will say, oh, you religious people, you've had to turn your brains off, you're anti-science, I go where the evidence leads. I look at what the world tells me and I make logical conclusions. But actually, that belies the truth, which is it is a religion. Here's a lovely billboard in the US next to a highway. And if you think about this billboard a bit, it's pretty revealing, isn't it? Praise Darwin, evolved beyond belief. And it was put up by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. But notice the lovely copperplate writing, looks like King James Bible, doesn't it, with all that illustrated letters and so on. Talk about a religion. So we're talking about not science versus faith at all. We're discussing the conflict between two belief systems. Now it's acted out in the arena of science. And the other guy who has seized the debate, and he couches it all in terms of the evidence is all in favour of evolution and the world making itself. You Christians just have to cling blindly to what this ancient book, you believe, says. So remember what we said about science in the previous talk? Experimental science is about observable, repeatable experiments. Historical science was about the unobserved and unrepeatable past. Another way of summarising that is to say that science studies repeatable things, but history studies unrepeatable things. So when we're discussing the question of origins, science actually is not the proper discipline we should be using. Right? You can't observe origins, you can't do experiments on origins. So it's the wrong discipline. We should be studying history. And if you study history, get a history book, particularly the history book of the universe, you'll find out what actually happened from the eyewitness account. Now, these cells that God created every living thing from are like the building blocks of life, and they're quite amazing things. For instance, they range anywhere from a tenth of a millimetre all the way up to 5 thousandths or 5 microns in size. Some nerve cells can be up to 1 metre long, would you believe, and the spinal cord and so on. A few are just a few micrometres in diameter. They widely vary in shape depending on their function. Covering layers have a cubic, flat or prismatic cells. Muscle cells might be spherical or spindle-shaped. And they perform vastly different functions within the body. In the human body, there are 210 different types of cell, but they all begin from an undifferentiated precursor or an original one. So if you think about it, when the egg is fertilised, then you are starting off with a single cell which then proceeds to divide and divide and divide, all under programmed control from the DNA, and the cells differentiate. They become cells for making blood vessels, for making bones, for making various organs in the body. Extraordinary the way that works. The various functions are encoded in the information stored in the DNA. The human body's got 100 million cells. That's 500 times more cells than there are stars in the Milky Way. Each individual one of us. There are 25 million red blood cells and 10 million brain cells. Well, that depends on... You can see it coming, couldn't you? You know, first thing when you wake up, you're struggling to find a handful. And after you've had a cup of coffee, there they are. Absolutely extraordinary. You can ask, how old am I? And I could say to you, well, which bit of me do you mean? For instance, my skin is probably only 2 weeks old at max, because the cells are replaced continually on our skin. The hair on your head could be up to 6 or 7 years old. Your liver cells are replaced every 300 to 500 days, about once a year approximately. The gut lining is replaced every 2 or 3 days. The taste buds are replaced every 10 days. So if you don't like the taste of something, just wait a couple of weeks and have another go. The skeleton cells are replaced about every 10 years. A constant replenishment is happening within the body. The central cortex cells, however, are not renewed. So it's quite fascinating how the body was designed to regenerate. People often say, how could Adam have lived for 930 years? Those ages in Genesis are obviously rubbish. You're lucky if you get to 100 these days. But the body was not designed to die. You think about it, we were not designed to die. We were designed to live forever on this earth. And the reason death is often a painful process is because stuff's going wrong. But now, because of the curse of sin and death, the body now undergoes a dying process, for which it was never originally designed. So when we look at a cell, we find staggering complexity. Now these words were written by a guy called Michael Denton in a book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. Now he was a secular biologist who actually stopped and thought about what he was teaching his students at university. He was at Melbourne University. After this book got published, he ended up leaving the university. Not entirely sure that it was his intention or his wish to leave, but he did, and he's now in New Zealand, I believe, in a university there. I don't know if he's yet a Christian. He may well be, because he's written some subsequent books that really look deeply and objectively into the science of biology. So Michael Denton, when not a Christian, writes, to grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it is 20 kilometres in diameter and resembles a giant airship large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. We would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. Now, years and years ago, when I read Denton's book, I was absolutely amazed at how effectively he demolished evolutionary biology. It was amazing, and written by an unbeliever, which made it even more powerful, I think. Now, what he's saying there is quite incredible. When you examine the interior of a cell like that, you find there are all these incredible machines that operate within the cell. It's not just a blob of jelly-like stuff, right? By no means. Now, in fairness to Charles Darwin, they had no idea in the 1800s what was inside a cell. It's really only been in relatively recent decades, certainly in my lifetime, that technology has enabled scientists to look into a living cell and see what goes on. And one of the little machines is this little guy. He's a motor kinesin. Some of you may have seen this. He's like a postman, a delivery service. So he takes proteins that are manufactured in various parts of the cell and he delivers them to the parts of the cell where they are needed. Some are even then taken outside of the cell membrane and delivered to some other parts of the body. But the little postal service is quite amazing. So we've got an animated clip here which is based on some very clever imaging technology that shows what this little guy looks like and how he operates. So get a load of this.
Inside a living cell is an amazing transportation system. Proteins have to be delivered to the correct part of the cell to perform their intended functions. This animation, based on a lot of clever research over a number of years, shows how it happens. Highways made of microtubules are assembled by interlocking proteins, each manufactured in accordance with the coded instructions on the cell's DNA. Marching along a microtubule is the kinesin motor, the hero of our story, carrying a huge sack of proteins to be delivered to the place in the cell. Here, the proteins will be released to fulfill their functions. A kinesin linear motor uses 1 ATP to provide the energy for each step and takes 125,000 steps to cover 1 millimetre. This amazing machine shows all the hallmarks of design.
Now, I'm not too sure about the little dance at the end. But isn't that incredible? This little guy marches along this highway carrying all these proteins. We've got address labels to say where they have to go. Now, that's greatly slowed down. He goes much, much faster than that in reality. But that's just an example of some of the machinery which is going on inside the cell. Absolutely staggering. Professor Paul Davies, who's an Australian but not a Christian, says nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organise themselves into the first living cell. Now, if you think about it, that's what the evolutionist has to believe, that somehow or other, lifeless chemicals lying around in the dirt, somehow or other, maybe through a stroke of lightning or whatever they proposed, became the first replicating cell. Quite extraordinary. And he's not saying he doesn't believe it happens, he's just saying no one knows how it happens. But the question he asks is the real killer. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Because what you saw there with that little machine is software controlled. It's not just hardware, it's not just a passive machine. It's a machine that does special things and not the same all the time, depending on what the software has required. Now, software is information. If you want to construct something, you need plans, you need a design, like this building, for instance. So the plans are what contain information. So inside every living cell, we have information about how to assemble that cell and, on a larger scale, the organism itself. So information specifies living things. Now think of it like this. You could write down all the instructions required to make a single-celled bacterium. And you'd need something like a 500-page book, like a volume of an encyclopedia or something. Now, I have to be careful with the age of the audience that I'm talking to when I use the word encyclopedia. I had a youth group once and they all looked blankly at me, so I said, well, that's like a printed version of Wikipedia. Oh, now they've got it. So you can imagine a certain number of instructions for assembling a single bacterium. Now, if you wanted to make something bigger and more complex, like a horse, now you need a lot more information for making bones, muscles, eyes, heart, lungs, hair, the list goes on and on. You need books, many, many books more full of information. But the thing is, how do the books get written? The information in the books is the information that defines what the organism is going to be when it's been made. So where does that information come from? Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but it's all encoded onto the DNA molecule, which is this amazing double helix structure, and all the letters which go to make those books of information are the base pairs, as they're called, between the two strands of the DNA. Now, human DNA has the equivalent of about 1,000 large books full of information. That's the equivalent of about 3 billion letters. Now, there's approximately just under 5 billion letters in the English Bible. So we need the equivalent of about 650 Bibles to hold the information stored on the human genome. Let's give you some idea of just how much information is actually there. So what is this information? So it's an interesting concept. I want to sort of get at it from a couple of different angles. One is how it's transmitted. That gives us a bit of an idea about the nature of information. So here's me and here's you, right? You're a lot better looking than me, right? I think it's obvious. Now, information arises in my mind, which I want to impart to you. So the first thing I do is I encode that information in a language. Obviously right now it's English because that's what I'm speaking to you, but I could be writing, in which case it would be in a written form, but it must obey the rules of spelling and grammar. If I was breaking all the rules of grammar, you wouldn't know what I was talking about, or you'd be confused. If you were reading it and I spelt things wrong, you might also be confused. So it's then transmitted. Right now it's being transmitted by sound. I'm speaking, you're hearing me. And hopefully you decode what I'm saying using the same rules of spelling and grammar. And if the process has worked properly, the information that arose in my mind finally ends up in your mind. And there's been a successful transmission of information. But for that system to work, both of us have to have that predetermined set of rules of spelling and grammar. Because if you don't, it doesn't work. For instance, let's say you saw these 4 letters. Now, because we're English, we think, well, it's a gift. Someone's giving me, it's a present, right? But if I was German, what would I think those 4 letters meant? Does anybody know? What's GIFT mean in German? Well, it means poison. Now, after the Second World War, German postal workers were very nervous about handling parcels from England with gift written on them, right? Until it was explained, oh, that's okay, that means a present. How about these 4 letters? That conjures up in my mind a casual conversation over a cup of coffee, right? A chat. But if you were French, what do those 4 letters mean? Anybody know?
Cat.
A cat, yeah. Now, if you've got the wrong code of letters and grammar and words, we can't communicate. We've got to have that predetermined code in place in the sender and in the receiver before any information transmission can even take place. Now remember, all that information is written on the DNA code, which has to be read by the machinery in the cell, so it has to mean things to the machinery in the cell, and it had to come from the mind originally. So, information can be defined a number of different ways. I won't go through all of that, but I think probably the second one is a very useful definition. It's specified complexity. Something complex which is specified, not just randomly complex, but specific. And a good example is traffic lights. You know, they're effective because the code is predetermined and universally known. So it's not only the colour of the light, but it's the position of the light. So even colourblind people can read traffic lights, okay? The top one means I stop. So can information come about by accident, by chance? Now just imagine that you're eating a bowl of alphabet soup. Has anyone ever had alphabet soup? Remember that from your childhood days? I don't know if you can still get it. Is it possible? Alphabet soup. I haven't seen it, but anyway. You used to have all the little letters, remember, as pasta. So there you go. What if you dipped your spoon in and up it came and that's what you saw? Now, what would you think? You go, what? What's the chance of that happening? By accident. Well, we can actually work it out because we know there are 26 letters in the alphabet, plus a space, plus some special characters. So the chance of getting an A in your first trial is probably 1 in, I don't know, 30 perhaps. Or if you took, so if you took a space and let's say we limited ourselves just to the question mark, 28 options in the first letter, then you got 28 options for the second letter and 28 options for the third letter and so on, right? And you can multiply that out. Mathematicians do it all the time. The chance of that happening just by accident, as a sheer fluke, is the same as guessing an 18-digit pin in one shot without making a mistake. What do you think about that? Now I've got a credit card and it's protected with a 4-digit pin, and the financial industries in Australia consider that secure enough. So what's the probability that you could guess the pin on my credit card in one shot with 4 digits? Anybody know? Got any mathematicians? So you've got 1 chance in 10 of getting the first digit right. You've got 1 chance in 10 of getting the second digit right.
1 in 10,000.
1 in 10,000. 1 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. So you've got 1 chance in 10,000 of guessing the pin on my credit card. This is like guessing an 18-digit pin without making a mistake. And that's a really simple bit of information. Are you happy? Not much information in that, is there? Amazing. So it's clearly impossible for it to happen by chance. So the evolutionists put forward a number of mechanisms by which information can arise. The first one is natural selection. This was Darwin's idea. He thought that natural selection would permit a simple organism to slowly develop and become more complex. So you start with that first cell and you end up ultimately with human beings. all through random processes selected by natural selection because the next version is better suited to the environment and produces more offspring. So if it produces more offspring, it's going to be more successful and it'll produce more offspring, and so it gets better and better and better and better, and here we are. Well, let's have a look at natural selection. So this is how it works. So here we've got two dogs that have got medium length hair, and let's just assume that the length of the hair is determined by just two genes, which is more complex than that, but that's the purpose of argument. So one gene gives short hair, the other gene gives long hair. So each of these two little dogs have medium length hair because I've got one short, one long. And assuming they're codominant genes. So how many ways can we get puppies from these two? Well, the first one, he comes along having selected the short-haired gene from each of his parents. So he will have very, very short hair. The next two are a bit like their parents. They've got a long and a short-haired gene. So they've got medium length hair. Now this little guy, he gets the jackpot, and he ends up with the long-haired gene from each of his parents, so he's a very hairy little dog. Okay, all of those options are possible with that two-gene combination. Now let's imagine that population of dogs migrates to a very cold country. Lots of ice and snow and sleet and so on. The short and medium length-haired dogs will be selected against by the environment because they're not well suited to live there. But the little dogs with the long hair will be nice and warm and will survive quite well. So let's imagine that those two fall in love and they're going to produce a bunch of puppies, but guess what? Every single one of them will have long hair, right? They will have been selected by the environment and they'll be suitable to live in a cold country. But can you see what's actually happened? You see, we've now reduced the amount of genetic information. There's been a loss of genes for short and medium length hair. It's gone downhill, hasn't it? There's less information than there was before. So natural selection actually reduces information. But wait a minute, the evolutionary story has to increase information. Remember, you went from one book for the little bacterium to hundreds and hundreds of books full of information to make a complex organism. You've got to go uphill. Natural selection goes downhill. Works the wrong way. So natural selection doesn't cut it. Now, the biologists are no fools. They figured that out and thought, oops, that didn't work, did it? So maybe there's another method. Maybe it's mutations that do it. Now, mutation is an abrupt change in the instructions in the DNA. A random accident happens and a letter changes. And the idea is that if that random change leads to a better organism that's more fit, that can produce more offspring, then that might be the way in which we progress from simple to complex, because there'll be more offspring with that mutation, and so on. Well, let's have a look at it. Mutations add information. So this is Carl Sagan, who wrote, mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It's rare that a precision machine is improved by random changes in the instructions for making it. Now, we all know intuitively that that's the case, and I can attest that if you made a random change in the instructions for assembling a spacecraft, for instance, you would get a faulty product out the factory door. You know, it's intuitively obvious, isn't it? It doesn't work that way, because mutations are copying mistakes. Let's say I had this simple sentence, the cat sat on the mat, I make a few copying mistakes, have I added information? Well, of course not. I've corrupted it. So mutations or errors almost always delete or corrupt information. Random copying errors cannot account for the encyclopedic quantities of information in DNA. It simply makes no sense. And it doesn't work. Mathematically and statistically, it fails. But there are some interesting mutations. This one is of a little rooster who's lost the information for making feathers. Well, it hasn't actually been lost. What's happened is it's been switched off. So the feather making process never happens when it's an embryo. So poor little guy who gets born without any feathers. Now, if you were the chook farmer, you'd probably think that's a brilliant mutation because now you don't have to pluck the chooks, right? But if you were the little rooster there, I think you would probably not think it's so good because you're going to get cold in winter and sunburn in summer, right? Now, interestingly, this has a technical name. It's the TNR mutant, and that stands for totally naked rooster. Like keeping it up. That's exactly what it means. But we know that mutations in real life don't lead to good things. And we see all kinds of weird effects happening when mutations arise in embryo. They don't lead to beneficial outcomes. But then some people say, well, but you can have a beneficial mutation, and yes, you can. But a beneficial mutation doesn't mean that there is more information. It still is a loss. And the classic example is the wingless beetle on a windy island. Now that's a great mutation to have, because if you could fly on that windy island, the odds are you're going to get blown off into the sea and drown. The ones that have a mutation in them and they're born without wings survive on the island and reproduce, but their cousins on the mainland fly. But has it added information? Well, no. It's a loss of information, but a beneficial loss of information. So don't allow people to confuse you between beneficial mutations and information gaining mutations. So mutations don't cut it either. So does anybody know what the third approach is that biologists are now proposing? There isn't one. They've got no idea. There is no mechanism by which natural processes can add genetic information. It just isn't there. And it's kind of like a trade secret, so we don't talk about it. We just press on and teach all our students that it happens. It's amazing. It really is a lack of honesty. Now, Richard Dawkins was asked this question. We mentioned Dawkins in the previous talk. And the question was, Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome? Okay, now Dawkins is the world's leading advocate for evolution, right? And this is a basic part of the evolutionary process. Surely there must be any number of examples he could give. So I want to play a little clip out of this video called From a Frog to a Prince. And it's interesting to see how Dawkins responds to this question.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Well, I think his silence is very, very eloquent. It was actually worse than that. It went on a bit longer than he asked for the cameras to be stopped. And then he came back on and answered a question other than what he was asked. And you can see all of that in that video, which you can get from our website. But it's very telling, isn't it? He hasn't got an answer. But he did say once, when asked, has evolution been observed? And he said, oh, evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Think about that. Now, in fairness to Dawkins, what he means is the process is apparently so slow you don't see it happening in your lifetime. But it's pretty telling nonetheless. Okay. So, Professor Paul Davies again, there is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. You see, for the evolutionists to bolster their idea of development from simple to complex through natural processes, we have to discover a whole new law of physics which so far hasn't been found. But friends, that's not science. That's blind faith, isn't it? Sheer blind faith. Back in 1953, there was a couple of scientists who conducted a very famous experiment. It gets taught in biology classes. Those of you who studied, anybody study biology, by the way? You would have been a nurse, Eunice. Yeah, Jenny has. Okay, so If you look at the biology, and the Miller-Urey experiment is still in the biology textbooks, right? So what they were trying to show was that you could accidentally create the building blocks of life. And the building blocks of life are these things called amino acids. So they tried to create the early Earth's atmosphere that would have an atmosphere that would have methane, ammonia and hydrogen in it. There'd be some kind of lightning strike simulated there, and then an apparatus by which they could extract any products of the process. And they ran this for quite some time. I can't remember how long, I think it was a couple of weeks or something. After 2 weeks, they found 10 to 15% of the carbon in the system was in the form of organic compounds. About 2% of those were amino acids, the building blocks of life. Now, the problem they've got is that they couldn't have oxygen in this simulated atmosphere because oxygen prevents the formation of amino acids. It destroys them. But if you don't have oxygen, it means you don't have an ozone layer. And if you don't have an ozone layer around the Earth, what is it that reaches the surface of the Earth at dangerous levels?
Ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet. What does ultraviolet do? Ultraviolet destroys amino acids. So they were stuck between a rock and a hard place, really. So, anyway, and they also required a very special trap to try and extract these amino acids. So it definitely was not representative of what the Earth's atmosphere would have been like. And in fact, it's now well accepted that the atmosphere would have had oxygen in it, so the experiment really was not representative. So was it evidence for chemical evolution? Well, not really. Amino acids were produced, but in tiny traces, grossly contaminated, and with this interesting property, it was racemic, meaning it had an equal mix of right and left-handed orientations. Now, amino acids are like our hands. They're mirror images of one another. And they have the same, 5 fingers, same sort of properties, same abilities, grasping, all the rest of it. And amino acids are like that too, but amazingly, in living systems, only left-handed amino acids are found. Only left-handed. But they're produced in equal quantities in a random process. So it's a bit like this. If you had an amino acid string, which is what a protein is, let's say it consisted of 300 amino acids, you have to select, by chance, 300 left-handed only amino acids in the right sequence to be able to form one protein. So if you toss a coin, you've got to have 300 heads, if you like, in a row. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was tossing a coin and I got 3 or 4 or 5 heads in a row, I'd be looking pretty closely at that coin, wouldn't you? Let alone 300. Once again, the statistics of it show that it really cannot happen. I love this little cartoon. Here's the professor with all his complex equipment and apparatus and equations on the board, and he thinks to himself, if I can just synthesise life here, then I'll have proven that no intelligence was necessary to form it in the beginning. Now, this is an experiment which you should not attempt at home, right? Here we have a hapless tree frog which has jumped into a blender. Now, the reason...
My wife collects green tree frogs.
Oh, okay, right. So, okay, don't tell her about this.
No, we won't try this.
Don't tell her. Okay. If you had all... Let's say that you could get all the amino acids, the building blocks, all together. You have to actually assemble them, right? You've got to now assemble them in the right sequence in order to be able to get a self-replicating living cell. So what happens to the hapless tree frog who jumps into the blender? We end up with frog soup. Now, in the frog soup, we have got all the amino acids, all of the RNA, the DNA, the proteins, everything you need to make a frog. How long will you have to wait before a frog jumps out of that blender? It's not going to happen, is it? It'll be a rather stinky mess before very long. Okay, so having all the bits doesn't help you. Even if you could get them, which I've just shown you can't, you have to assemble them in the right way. Now, Professor Sir Fred Hoyle, who is not a Christian, a very astute scientist, observed, the chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way, that's through the chance assemblage of chemicals, is comparable with the chance of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard that it might assemble a Boeing 747 from the material therein. So think about it. You've got a tornado sweeps through a junkyard, picks up all the bits, and they all come down together, and guess what? You've got a fully operating jumbo jet. How ridiculous. It just isn't going to happen, is it? But his analogy is that's the kind of probabilities we're talking about. Isn't that amazing? So the secular scientists know that this can't happen. They really are faced with an incredible dilemma. But what about the biblical creationists? In the beginning, God created. There's a causal agent. There's an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God who spoke the universe into being in accordance with his plan and design. How much more rational an explanation is that compared to having to believe the unbelievable? But there's yet another problem that stops parts being assembled by chance. And the analogy I want to use here is of a mousetrap. Now, a mousetrap has got a few basic parts. It's representative of what you could call something that is irreducibly complex. Now, it's complex because it's got various moving parts and it has to fulfill a function. But it's irreducibly complex because there's no part that you can take away and still have it work like a mousetrap. So here's the bits, right? These are the bits you need to make a mousetrap. I'm going to assemble all of those and I'm going to leave a piece out. There it is. What's missing from my mousetrap? Yeah, the little holding bar thing, right? Yeah. Now, what would you get if you used a mousetrap like that?
You wouldn't get a mouse up there.
Get a piece of thing up there.
You'd have very fat, happy mice, wouldn't you? They'd be coming back every night. Well, another meal. You see, it fails because it hasn't got all of its parts all at once. And that's the same with the biological system. You can't have a partly formed biological system offering any value to a living organism. Think of a partly formed eye that's got, maybe it's got the iris and the lens and the retina, but there's no optic nerve connecting it to the brain. What use is that to the organism? It's still just as blind as it ever was. So how can an organism progress from simple to complex in small incremental steps? See, it can't happen because of irreducible complexity. Now, Darwin was pretty upfront about this. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Guess what? We've just demonstrated that you can't do it. So, his theory breaks down. Oh, well, no, hang on a minute. Can't have that. There has to be a workaround. Why does there have to be a workaround? Because we have to explain the universe without God. Why is it that mankind is so intent on rejecting God?
It doesn't want to have consequences for his actions.
Absolutely. We don't want to have someone who might ultimately hold us accountable for how we've lived our lives. Mankind does not want a creator God, and that is what lies at the root of the whole origins debate. Remember what I said at the beginning? Understanding Genesis changes everything. What if people did believe Genesis? Man, what a different society we would have. There are some amazing examples of organisms. The famous one is called the bacterial flagellum. It's like an outboard motor on the wall of the cell, and as the motor rotates, that flagellum undertakes a whip-like movement which propels the little bacterium along. But what's even more amazing is how that particular thing is assembled. Now you've got to remember this is all happening from inside the cell. So these different proteins are manufactured in accordance with the coding on the DNA. They're then put together, and you've got what is virtually an electric motor, which is made with a stator and armature and so on, all the bits that we have for electric motor. But now you've got to penetrate the surface of the cell. So a special tool comes along. Here's there is, and it breaks through the outer layer, but in a clever way that seals it so that the cell doesn't die. Because if you puncture the outer layer of the cell, you'll kill the cell. And then these proteins come up through the centre of this core, are assembled into a thing which is effectively a universal joint, and all the bits that are being made by stored program control, remember, from within the cell, all delivered up through the flagellum. That pinkish coloured orangey tool thing there is a 5-sided device, and it's making a 6-sided flagella. So it's got this rotation built into it, and you'll see all the pieces being assembled and locked into place. And that continues on, and there you see the flagella finally manufactured, and as it rotates, it produces that wave-like motion, and it throws it along. That is, I think, that the assembly of the flagella is even more amazing than its operation. And all of that is happening from inside the cell. Now, a famous evolutionist called J.B.S. Haldane made this prediction. He said, various mechanisms such as the wheel and the magnet, which would be useless until fairly perfect, is based, sorry, I missed the first bit. Evolution could never produce. Now, that was written in 1949, right? Evolution could never produce a wheel. What have we just seen? Effectively an electric motor and a universal joint. And we now know that there are bacteria that align themselves to this magnetic field. So there are magnets that are actually built into bacteria. And there we go, 1949, he figured out that it couldn't exist, but guess what? So when we look at this cell, I want to show you another little mechanism which is amazing. We have mitochondria inside our cells, and they're like the little powerhouse that keeps the energy going into our cells. Inside the mitochondria are these membranes called cristae, and embedded on those are these amazing machines. It's called the ATP synthase enzyme. Now, you don't have to remember all of this stuff, but I'm just trying to point out the astonishing complexity of what happens, of what God's creative genius has done. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and that is the energy currency of the cell. So this machine takes adenosine diphosphate, so you see it there on the right-hand side, combines it with a phosphate ion, and then delivers it to the cell to power the machinery, the thing that we saw before, the motor kinesin and all sorts of other machines. So this little animated clip gives you an idea of how the ATP synthase enzyme works. And remember, there are thousands of these in every single cell in your body. They empower the cells of your body. If these were not working, you would be dead.
This animated sequence shows the ATP synthase enzyme in operation. The animation is based on an incredible series of scientific discoveries. Only the colours show artistic license. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency of the cell. ATP is produced by a tiny molecular rotary motor, rotating it up to 7,000 RPM. It's so small that 100,000 would fit side by side in a millimetre. A current of protons drives the motor, unlike man-made electric motors, which use electrodes. This portion of the enzyme is where adenosine diphosphate is combined with a phosphate ion in the presence of a catalyst to produce ATP, which is then released, making way for the next cycle. A top view of the enzyme shows the sequential operation. Almost every biochemical process in your body requires ATP. Such a nano machine exhibits all the characteristics of super intelligent design. ATP is vital to life, and many of these motors were needed before the first living cell could exist. An evolutionary impossibility.
An amazing little gadget, isn't it? And you think of that happening, but how would that have happened by chance? You've got to have all these bits and pieces lying about in some warm little puddle perhaps, and then they all combine, and even if they made one, that'd be a miracle, but you've got to make thousands of them to make even one cell work. It's absolutely staggering. So, Sir Fred Hoyle again, the probability of the formation of just one of the many proteins on which life depends is comparable to that of the solar system, packed full of blind people, randomly shuffling Rubik's cubes and all arriving at the solution at the same time. Can you imagine that? Blind people shuffling Rubik's cubes, so many they could fill the entire solar system. Imagine what that would look like. All right? How bizarre. And yet, people believe it. So, let me just, in the interest of time, move on to the next bit that I want to cover off on. Okay, so here we have one of the guys who received the Nobel Prize for Science, a very smart guy, who talks about this whole process of how life might have originated from non-life by chance. Spontaneous generation is called. And he said, one has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. And you think, wow, he's got it. Praise God. But he goes on and says, yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. But what? He just said it was impossible, and then he says, I believe. Now you talk about people having faith. Man, that guy's got phenomenal faith. He can believe the impossible. It's like, wasn't it Alice in Wonderland? You have to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. Quite extraordinary. I'm reminded of Romans 1:22, professing to be wise, they became fools. In fact, it was Louis Pasteur in the middle 1800s who formulated what we now call the law of biogenesis, that life only originates from life. And friends, that is observable science. That's the science that we see. That's what we can observe. And remember this scripture that I had before from Romans 1:20. Men are without excuse. And that is inexcusable, isn't it? To recognise that it's impossible and then just believe it anyway. Why? Because I don't want there to be a God. That's why. That's what's driving it. Amazing. Now, you've probably seen this kind of a chart, the geological timescale, all the millions of years down the left-hand side, and all the arrangement of the fossils. And people say, see, this proves the long, slow progression of organisms and so on. But if that were true, there'd be all these intermediate stages, you know. And Darwin himself said this, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection that can be urged against the theory. So he's pretty upfront, isn't he, really? He basically acknowledges, well, the evidence in the fossil record doesn't support my theory, but I'm pretty confident that as more and more fossils are found, then it will. So 150 years after Darwin wrote those words, a guy called Colin Patterson, who was a paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, wrote a book on fossils. Now someone wrote to him asking him about the transitional forms, and he wrote back and said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any... Now, evolution is the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links not seen. And I say that with apologies to the writer of Hebrews 11:1. So actually, when we look at this chart, it's actually better description of the order in which things were buried during the flood. Now, I just want to touch quickly on the last aspect of this, and that's the so-called claims of the origin of human beings. Now, you'll have heard a lot about how we have our closest relative with the chimps and how we've descended from apes over the years. And apparently there are 4 broad classes of humans that have all come from the great apes at some stage or other. And this actually says things about the concept of race and racism, which I haven't got time to talk too much about this weekend, but racism is actually now culture fueled by evolutionary belief. It's not fueled by slavery, as we're led to believe, or the history of slavery. So Darwin said this, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilised races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, instead of, as now, between the Negro or Australian, he means the Aboriginal of course, and the gorilla. Isn't that interesting? He wrote that in The Descent of Man. And that actually is the engine of present day racism. The idea that darker skinned people were closer to the apes, therefore were less developed, and white skinned and Asian people are at the top of the evolutionary tree. And I'm sure you've all seen that kind of a chart. It's the classic icon of evolution. Now, one of my colleagues, Scott Devlin, has produced a short video clip which examines the evidence for this ape-to-man transition, and I think he does a really excellent job of this.
You may recognise this image from school textbooks, t-shirts, soda adverts, and everything in between. But what if I were to tell you that if we're to be honest with the evidence that we have, this picture should look more like this? Let me explain. On the left is what is believed to be the first ape, known as Proconsul, and on the right is a human called Homo sapiens. But what scientific evidence is there for everything else in this image? The transitional species. Let's find out. We'll start with Homo neanderthalensis. You might know him as Neanderthal man. Recent discoveries have shown that Neanderthal man made and wore jewelry, played instruments, used tools, and wore makeup. We've even found his brain was the same or slightly larger than the average human living today. In other words, Neanderthal man was actually just a man. What about Homo erectus? Recent discoveries have shown that Homo erectus made tools, engaged in artwork, spoke intelligent language, and made and sailed boats. In other words, Homo erectus was also just a man. Now we'll come back to Homo habilis in a moment, but first, let me show you something. Have you ever heard of Lucy, the most famous so-called ape man, paraded in our museums, one of the very first Australopithecus afarensis species ever to be found? But what does the evidence reveal? She had a skull that was sloped and ape-like, nothing like human skulls, fingers that were curved, not at all like human fingers, toes that were curved, not at all like human toes, wrists that had the ability to lock for knuckle walking, and a knee structure that was compatible with life in trees. So Lucy and her kind swung from trees and looked like today's apes. Lucy is an extinct type of ape. As we've just seen, Homo sapiens, Neanderthal man, and Homo erectus were all men. Australopithecus afarensis and Proconsul were both apes. Considering the ubiquity of the evolutionary icon, we'd really want to see some strong evidence for Homo habilis, the pivotal point of transition between stooped ape and upright man, between basic instinct and intelligent thought, between animal noise and intelligent speech. The only problem is, in the words of Ian Tattersall, Homo habilis is a wastebasket taxon, little more than a convenient recipient for a motley assortment of hominid fossils. Other scientists refer to him as a garbage bag because the bones we have for him are a mixture of human and ape bones. In other words, Homo habilis never existed. I think evolutionary professor Bernard Woods sums this up well. Our progress from ape to human looks so smooth, so tidy, it's such a beguiling image that even the experts are at low to let it go. But it is an illusion. With the lack of evidence and agreement on the ape-human transition forms, why is this not happening? Or this? And is a better explanation that man and apes have always coexisted and reproduced according to their own kind, as stated in Genesis 1.
I think that nails it beautifully, doesn't it? Does a really great job. You know, when scientists do these reconstructions of the bones, they often reveal their bias. And this guy said, I wanted to get a human soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where he was headed. You've got to think about that a little bit. Can you see how the the philosophical bias is revealed. You see, in evolution there can't be any heading, it has to be a random process. If it's directed, that implies there's something or some being directing it. And oops, we've now just invented a god, so can't have that. But what has he done to make it look human? Well, it turns out that apes do not have whites in their eyes. So when they did the reproduction, he's put the whites there and it makes it look vaguely human. Now, you often hear this claim made that we are genetically similar with chimpanzee. And there's less than 2% difference. In fact, some people claim 1 or even less than that, which is proof, we've descended from chimps. Well, even if that were true, which it's not, 2% would be 60 million letters of difference in the DNA. It takes 84 million, or would take 84 million years to get just 2 letters or 2 base pairs to line up together and be conserved in the DNA. And yet we're supposed to have separated from our common ancestors, chimps, just 7 million years ago. But you can only get 2 new letters in 84 million years. None of it stacks up. Now, this next little video clip I want to run actually comes from a secular website. And they're talking about this whole thing about measuring the genetic difference. And I want you to have a listen to this because it's really just a short clip. Here they are acknowledging a little bit about how close these two really are.
When researchers sat down to compare the chimp and human genomes, those single letter differences were easy to tally, but the big mismatch sections weren't. For example, if a genetic paragraph, thousands of letters long, appears twice in a human scroll, but only once in its chimp counterpart, should that second human copy count as thousands of changes, or just one? And what about identical paragraphs that appear in both genomes, but in different places, or in reverse order, or broken up into pieces? Rather than monkey around with these difficult questions, the researchers simply excluded all the large mismatch sections, a whopping 1.3 billion letters in all, and performed a letter-by-letter comparison on the remaining 2.4 billion, which turned out to be 98.77% identical. So, yes, we share 99% of our DNA with chimps if we ignore 18% of their genome and 25% of ours.
Did you get that? So they don't tell you that, do they? They say, we're 98% the same. Well, yeah, if you ignore 18% of the chimp genome and 25% of ours. See, the number's nothing like that at all. Profoundly different. But remember, they had to miss out a whopping 1.3 billion letters. They just ignored them because they didn't know what to do or how to count them. Quite incredible. So, in the interest of time, let me skip that, although it's all incredibly interesting. I want to just come to a conclusion, and that is where we picked up in the session this morning, that we are to always be prepared. If someone comes up to you and runs that line about how we're genetically similar to the apes, say, well, no, not quite. And there are articles on our website, refer them to those, and they can have a look and see what is actually the case. So we need to be prepared, and that's what our website is about. Get onto the website. I mentioned the Answers book earlier on. That's got chapters in it that look at some of these issues as well. And we've got a book called Evolution's Achilles Heels, and it has a companion DVD. And that book was written by 9 PhD scientists that looked at the so-called claimed strengths of evolution and showed each of them to be a weakness, in other words, an Achilles heel. I had the privilege of being one of the contributing authors to that book, and the DVD interviews 15 PhD scientists at looking at different aspects of this whole debate. We also have this fabulous Genesis Academy. It's a 12-part teaching series on the first 11 chapters. Each of the DVDs is about 35 minutes long, and there's a study guide which is available on the website as well. Lots of videos which are available for live streaming off our website, which is just a goldmine. So let me just quote David Attenborough. Someone asked him the question, why don't you give credit to Almighty God? Good question, eh? So what he says is, well, when creationists talk about God creating, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in West Africa, a worm that is going to make him blind. And I asked them, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you also say is an all-merciful God, who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God created this worm that can live in no other way than in an innocent child's eyeball? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide with a God who's full of mercy. That's a good point, because he does see amazing order and design and beauty in the world around us. And those series that he does are fantastic to see. The photography is just brilliant. But his interpretation is based on the evolutionary belief. By the way, he's wrong about the life cycle of those little worms. They can live in other places than eyeballs, but they do live in eyeballs. But you see, his worldview consists of this belief that there's been millions and millions of years of evolution before mankind even turns up. So if there's a God, then God must have used this terrible, cruel, wicked process for creating, including making this little worm that makes children blind. I mean, what kind of a God is that? And you know, I'd be with him. If that was the case, I probably wouldn't want to have anything to do with such a God. But that's not the correct version of history, is it? The history book of the universe tells us it was Adam's actions in the garden that led to suffering and death and all that we see in this broken world. And that's why, as I've shared before, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. That is the basis of our gospel message. So praise God for the beauty of his creation and the wonders of his most amazing grace. And